Hey folks, Dr. Phil here. This is going to be a video on research design and kind of giving you a bit of an overview of research design. So firstly, what is research design? So there's different ways we could think of this, like, you know, how are we designing the research obviously is the forefront of this, and is foremost. But looking at things like the framework of the research we're going to do. I will say that probably not enough not enough researchers spend enough time in this phase, and it leads to poor, not as good research as they could have done. Perhaps, it leads them to maybe faulty methodology, methodological processes. So we think about things like frameworks, plans, blueprints, a guide to, this is sort of like the kind of put down like what you're going to do. So research design essentials. So we'll have a time-based plan. It's good to you don't have to put a time base to most of them, but you generally want to do that because it kind of helps you stay on track. Should be based on research questions. So you don't really do the research design until you've figured out the research question. A guide for selecting sources of information and methods, and a framework for specifying relationships among variables. So, if you look at where we are, we're sort of from stage one going into stage two, right? Design the research. So, again, not collecting the data, not sampling it, just figuring out how we're going to collect the data, how we're going to sample the data, figuring out what the measurement questions will be, and then helping us to ultimately, at least for stage two, develop the measurement instrument. An exploratory study. So these are a little more loose. They're not quite as kind of rigid as other types of studies. So as it says, a loose structure, perhaps help you expand your understanding of a dilemma, may provide insight on a management problem. Um, but you would still want to define a research question. And even if you were planning on using an exploratory study to help or try to help answer a question, a research question, you would still want to define the research question and the hypothesis, and then even if you decide to use an exploratory study. So some exploratory study methods could include what you see here. So participant observation, so perhaps something like a focus group, film, photographs, projective techniques, case studies, ethnographies, expert interviews, document analysis, proxemics, and even kinesics. So there's a lot of different types of exploratory, and there's other ones that that they're not mentioning there, that could potentially be used in the exploratory fashion. So the formal study begins with a hypothesis and research questions, as I'm sure you're aware, um, with precise procedures for data collection and analysis. So we typically kind of spell that out. All my, my PhD dissertation, and of course all the articles I've published since. Most of mine are quantitative, so I'm very specific about this is how I'm going to do this. This is how I don't like to leave I don't want somebody to read my study and think, well, how did he collect the data? How did he run the analysis? Right? Everything is kind of laid out. And part of the reason for that is because of what we call replicability, because I want somebody to be able to go get the same data as me and replicate the study and get the same results, because that helps with the reliability of the study. It also speaks to its high internal validity. So some exploratory study methods, you could use self-administered surveys, maybe ones with like Likert scales. You could do that. Survey via personal interview. There's a lot of rich data to collect there, but it's very time consuming. Telephone surveys, could be true and pre-experiments, and even so. Think of like quasi experiments as something that you do that's maybe it probably is an experiment, but there may be elements of it that maybe would not be considered experimental. So data collection design, with respect to the method. So we could use monitoring. You can see here they're scanning this QR code. Communication, we might give somebody, maybe this is something that I've been on both sides of. Somebody's handed me a tablet, asked me to just fill out like a brief questionnaire. So yeah, sometimes there's a an incentive for doing so, and sometimes there's not. Other dimensions of data collection. So obviously the objective of the study, and we'll talk about all these briefly in sequence. The ability to manipulate the variables, the topical scope, the measurement emphasis, the complexity of design, the research environments, the time dimension, and the participants' awareness. Now, participants' awareness might seem, you might be like, why would that be in there? Well, there are certain studies done where participants are not actually aware that they're part of the research, and that's done for a reason. And that's always, of course, approved by what we call an IRB, Institutional Review Board, beforehand. And then typically the participants are then told at the end that they were kind of like blind participants. Subjective of the study, obviously reporting, descriptive, causal predictive, and causal explanatory. These would be sort of like the four, kind of the four, there could be other objectives too. These would typically be the four main objectives. So focusing on the past, then if we're going to focus on the past, then it's kind of stuff, the famous questions: who, what, when, where, and how much. If we're focusing on the now, then again, it's kind of the same questions, but now this speaks more to like a instead of sort of a past tense focus, right. It's more like a present tense kind of focus. So maybe there's a problem that's just come up that we're now looking to solve more so than like say a historical problem. Causal studies, causal explanatory, attempting to explain a phenomenon, and then causal predictive, maybe trying to understand, um, or predict something that will happen in the future. Weather would be a good example. The ability to manipulate variables. Um, as we change, as we maybe we I've done surveys and I've done research where I've maybe eliminated certain variables from the research because they weren't really adding anything to it. I've added other variables in. In regression analysis, in fact, there's a type of regression called stepwise regression where we literally do that. We kind of dump in a bunch of variables and the system tells us, the statistical processing package tells us, this is the order in which, like the importance of variables, if you will, and then maybe it shows you some other ones and says, these didn't really make any difference, and then maybe we then eliminate those from the study. So the ex post facto study, you may have heard that term like post facto. So just think about like after the fact. So an ex post facto study is an after the fact report on what happened to the measured variable. In this case, there's no manipulation possible because it's already been done, like it's in the past, like water under the bridge kind of thing. Experiment, a study involving the manipulation or control of one or more variables to determine the effect on another variable. So, how does this affect this? The topical scope, that's going to be, it might be very broad, it might be very narrow. One thing that if anybody watching this video decides to, one day undertake a sort of a PhD, DBA, any kind of doctoral program where research is required to finish, to graduate, to defend, as we say. One thing you will likely hear from your, PhD supervisor is, well, one thing you might hear is, why does anybody care about that when you go to them with your research idea? The other thing you might hear is it's too broad, like try to narrow it down. So that's, part of what I'm saying here is part of this is to sort of let you know that when you come to the topical scope, don't be too broad. It's okay to do something narrow. Um, Typical types is you might do a statistical study versus a case study. And what we're doing here is we're actually comparing these two, right? So a statistical study focuses on breadth, whereas a case study focuses on depth, right? A statistical study is making inferences about a population, whereas a case study is more just kind of detailed, but probably a lot less, participants, individuals, entities, whatever. A statistical study is obviously going to be quantitative, whereas a case study is more likely to be qualitative. Um, and the findings of the statistical study are more likely to be generalizable findings, whereas a case study probably involved like multiple sources of information. Most of the robust research is generally going to be done via statistical methods. So again, measurement emphasis, qualitative versus quantitative. The one thing about qualitative studies, they'll sometimes lend like context that you wouldn't perhaps find in a quantitative study. Most of the kind of the top journals in the world, they're looking for quantitative, like the stuff that you submit to them is quantitative. They're not really looking for qualitative. Um, but sometimes you'll get what's called a mixed method study where they've done like quantitative and qualitative. They've kind of done a bit of both. So that's one thing to kind of bear in mind. The research environment, are you doing it in a lab? Is it in field? Are you just simply simulating it? There's different experiences that come with these. There's different costs that also come with these. All right, thanks for watching, and I will see you all in a future video. Take care.